My name is Emily Carter, and I'm 22 years old. I've always been the quiet one in the family, the kind of person who prefers books to parties and solitude to small talk. My grandfather, Thomas Carter, was the only one who truly understood me. He was my anchor, my confidant, and the one person I could always count on. When he passed away last month, a part of me went with him. The funeral was a blur of tears and somber faces, but what came after was even harder to process: the reading of the will. I sat in the lawyer's office, flanked by my parents, David and Linda Carter. My father, a tall man with sharp features and a perpetual frown, sat stiffly in his chair. My mother, with her perfectly styled blonde hair and nervous smile, kept glancing at me as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. The lawyer, Mr. Harrison, cleared his throat and began reading. To my beloved granddaughter, Emily Carter, I leave the majority of my estate, including the sum of $1.5 million, to be held in trust until her 25th birthday. This money is to be used for her education, her future, and her dreams. I felt my breath catch in my throat. $1.5 million. For me. My parents exchanged a look, one I couldn't quite decipher. My father's jaw tightened, and my mother's hands clenched in her lap. The days following the reading of the will were a whirlwind of emotions. I felt a strange mix of gratitude for my grandfather's generosity and unease about the sudden shift in my parents' behavior. They had always been distant, but now they were hovering, asking questions, offering advice, and acting like they were deeply invested in my future. "Emily, have you thought about what you'll do with the money?" my mother asked one evening as we sat at the dinner table. Her tone was casual, but her eyes were sharp, searching. "Not really," I replied, pushing my food around my plate. "I guess I'll use it for school or maybe buy a house someday." "That's smart," my father chimed in, his voice unusually warm. "But you'll need help managing it. Money like that can be complicated." I nodded, not sure how to respond. It wasn't like them to be so involved. A few days later, the questions became more pointed. "Do you know where the money is being held?" my mother asked as we folded laundry together. "In a trust," I said, shrugging. "I won't have full access until I'm 25. "That's a long time," she murmured, her brow furrowing. "What if you need it before then?" "I don't think I will," I said, though her question made me uneasy. Then came the suggestions. "Emily, maybe you should give us access to the account," my father said one evening, his tone firm but not unkind. "Just in case something happens and you need us to handle things for you." I froze. "Why would I need you to handle it?" "You're young," he said, his voice softening. "Money like that can be overwhelming. We just want to help." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to believe they were genuinely looking out for me, but another part, the part that had grown up in a house where affection was rare, felt a flicker of suspicion. That suspicion turned to certainty one night. I was lying in bed, unable to sleep, when I heard raised voices coming from the kitchen. I crept downstairs, my heart pounding, and pressed myself against the wall just outside the door. "We can't keep this up, David," my mother hissed, her voice trembling with desperation. "The creditors are calling non-stop. If we don't pay them soon, they'll come after us." "I know," my father snapped, his voice low and tense. "But we can't just take the money. Emily will notice." "She's just a kid," my mother shot back. "She won't even know if some of it goes missing. We'll pay it back eventually." My stomach churned. They weren't planning to borrow, they were planning to steal. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. How could they do this to me? To grandfather's memory? I spent the next few days torn between anger and heartbreak. I wanted to confront them, to scream and demand answers, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. They had made up their minds. Finally, I made my decision. I couldn't let them take what was rightfully mine. The lawyer. I found Sarah Mitchell through an online search. Her firm specialized in inheritance disputes, and her reviews were glowing. "I need your help," I said when I met her in her office. "My parents are trying to steal my inheritance." Sarah listened intently as I explained the situation, her sharp eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and nodded. "We'll take them to court," she said firmly. "But you need to be prepared for what that means. This could get ugly." I nodded, my resolve hardening. I was ready to fight. Sarah and I spent the next few weeks gathering evidence. She helped me secure the trust and ensured that my parents couldn't access it without my permission. We also documented their attempts to pressure me into giving them control of the money. "This is going to be a tough case," Sarah warned me. "Family disputes always are. But we have a strong argument, and the truth is on our side." I nodded, though the weight of what I was about to do settled heavily on my shoulders. I wasn't just fighting for the money, I was fighting for my future, for the life my grandfather had wanted me to have. As the court date approached, the tension in the house became unbearable. My parents knew something was up, but they didn't know what. They tried to act normal, but their smiles were strained, and their questions grew more probing. "Emily, is everything okay?" my mother asked one evening, her voice dripping with false concern. "Everything's fine," I replied, my tone clipped. She frowned but didn't push further. The night before the court date, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, fear, sadness, and a strange sense of determination. This was it. Tomorrow, everything would change. The days leading up to the court case were a blur of preparation and anxiety. Sarah Mitchell, my lawyer, was a force to be reckoned with. She had a sharp mind, a no-nonsense attitude, and a way of making me feel like I wasn't alone in this fight. But even with her by my side, the weight of what I was about to do pressed down on me like a heavy blanket. I spent hours going over documents, signing papers, and rehearsing what I would say in court. Sarah was meticulous, leaving no stone unturned. "We need to be ready for anything," she said during one of our meetings. "Your parents' lawyer will try to paint you as ungrateful or naive. We can't let that happen." I nodded, my hands trembling as I flipped through the stack of papers in front of me. "What if they try to say I'm lying?" "They might," Sarah admitted. "But we have evidence, bank statements, emails, and your testimony. The truth is on our side, Emily. Remember that." The tension in the house was unbearable. My parents knew something was up, but they didn't know the extent of it. They tried to act normal, but their smiles were strained, and their questions grew more probing. "Emily, is everything okay?" my mother asked again, her voice thick with forced concern. "Everything's fine," I repeated, my tone clipped. She frowned but let it go. Later that night, my father cornered me in the kitchen. "Emily, we need to talk," he said, his voice low and serious. I crossed my arms, bracing myself. "About what?" "The money," he said, his eyes narrowing. "We're your parents. We're just trying to help you." "Help me?" I shot back, my voice rising. "By stealing from me?" His face turned red, and for a moment, I thought he might yell. But then he took a deep breath and forced a smile. "You're being dramatic," he said, his tone patronizing. "We're family. We take care of each other." "Not like this," I said, my voice shaking. "Grandfather left that money for me. Not for you." He stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. The night before the court date, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. My emotions twisted inside me: anger, fear, sadness, and a strange, unwavering determination. I thought about my grandfather, the way he had always believed in me. He had been my rock, my guiding light. And now, I was fighting to protect what he had left me. But at what cost? I thought about my parents, the years we had spent together. They had never been warm or affectionate, but they were still my family. Taking them to court felt like crossing a line, like burning a bridge I could never rebuild. But what choice did I have? The morning of the court date, I woke up early, my stomach in knots. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple but professional outfit, a navy blue blazer, a white blouse, and black slacks. I wanted to look confident, capable, like someone who deserved to be taken seriously. Sarah met me at the courthouse, her briefcase in hand and a determined look on her face. "Ready?" she asked. I nodded, though my heart pounded in my chest. "Remember," she said, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder, "the truth is on our side. Just stick to the facts, and let me handle the rest." The courtroom was cold and sterile, the air thick with tension. My parents sat on the other side of the room, their faces unreadable. My father looked stoic, his jaw clenched, while my mother kept glancing at me, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and something else, something that almost looked like fear. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. "This is a case regarding the inheritance of Emily Carter," the judge began, his voice calm but authoritative. "Let's begin." Sarah stood, her posture confident. "Your Honor, my client, Emily Carter, is here today to protect what is rightfully hers, an inheritance left to her by her late grandfather, Thomas Carter. Her parents, David and Linda Carter, have attempted to gain access to these funds under false pretenses, and we are here to ensure that Emily's future is secured." My parents' lawyer stood next, his tone smooth and practiced. "Your Honor, my clients are only trying to help their daughter. They have her best interests at heart and are simply looking to guide her in managing such a large sum of money." The back and forth continued, each side presenting their arguments. Sarah was relentless, her questions sharp and her evidence undeniable. Then it was my turn to speak. "Your Honor," I began, my voice trembling but clear, "my grandfather left this money for me because he believed in me. He wanted me to have a future. My parents, they don't care about my future. They only care about their debts." I paused, took a deep breath, and dropped the bombshell. "And they're not even my real parents." The room erupted in gasps. My parents' faces turned pale, their mouths hanging open in shock. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence, the air thick with tension. My parents, David and Linda Carter, sat frozen, their faces drained of color. Even their lawyer seemed momentarily speechless, his carefully rehearsed arguments crumbling in the face of the truth. The judge, a stern man with sharp eyes, leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Carter," he began, his voice calm but firm, "are you certain about what you've just stated?" I nodded, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the witness stand. "Yes, Your Honor. I found out a few years ago that I was adopted. They never told me, I discovered it by accident." The judge turned to my parents. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter, do you have anything to say in response to this?" My father shot up from his seat, his face red with anger, but my mother grabbed his arm, pulling him back down. Their lawyer quickly stepped in, smoothing his tie before speaking. "Your Honor, this is a deeply personal matter that has no bearing on the case at hand. My clients have raised Emily as their own daughter for over 2 decades. This revelation, while unfortunate, does not change the fact that they have always had her best interests at heart." Sarah was on her feet before he even finished. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this changes everything. Their deception regarding Emily's identity underscores their willingness to manipulate her for their own gain. They have no legal or moral claim to her inheritance." The judge held up a hand, silencing the courtroom. "I've heard enough. We will take a brief recess while I consider the evidence and testimony." As the courtroom emptied, I remained seated, my legs feeling like they might give out beneath me. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You did great," she said quietly. "Just hang in there a little longer." I nodded, though my mind was spinning. The truth was out, and there was no taking it back. Across the room, my parents huddled with their lawyer, their voices low and urgent. My father's face remained flushed with anger, while my mother kept glancing at me, her expression unreadable, guilt, regret, or something else entirely. I wanted to feel relief, but all I felt was an empty ache in my chest. This wasn't how I had imagined things would go. When the judge returned, the room fell silent once more. He took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and began. "After reviewing the evidence and testimony, it is clear that the inheritance left to Emily Carter by her late grandfather, Thomas Carter, was intended solely for her benefit. The attempts by David and Linda Carter to gain access to these funds, coupled with the lack of transparency regarding their relationship with Emily, demonstrate a clear conflict of interest." He paused, his gaze sweeping the courtroom. "Therefore, I rule in favor of Emily Carter. The inheritance will remain in her control, with no access granted to David or Linda Carter." The words hit me like a wave, relief and disbelief crashing over me in equal measure. I had won. But as I glanced at my parents, their faces twisted with anger and disappointment, the victory felt hollow. As the courtroom emptied, my parents approached me, their expressions unreadable. "Emily," my mother began, her voice trembling, "we need to talk." I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. "There's nothing left to say." My father stepped forward, his jaw tight. "You think you've won, but you've just destroyed this family." I met his glare, my voice steadied despite the lump in my throat. "You did that. Not me." They stared at me for a long moment, their faces shifting between fury and something that almost looked like regret. Then, without another word, they turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone. The weeks following the court case were a blur of emotions. I moved out of my parents' house and into a small apartment, determined to start fresh. The inheritance was mine, but the weight of everything that had happened still hung over me like a dark cloud. I spent my days unpacking boxes, setting up my new space, and trying to figure out what came next. Sarah had helped me secure the funds and set up a financial plan, but the emotional toll of the case was harder to navigate. One afternoon, as I sorted through a box of old belongings, my fingers brushed against the edge of an envelope tucked inside a book. The paper was yellowed with age, my name written on the front in my grandfather's familiar handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it, my heart pounding in my chest. "Dear Emily, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer with you. I wish I could be there to guide you, to see the person you're becoming, but I want you to know how proud I am of you. You've always been strong, even in the moments you doubted yourself, and I have no doubt you'll find your way. The inheritance I've left you is more than just money, it's a chance to build the life you've always dreamed of. Use it wisely, but don't let it hold you back. Take risks, chase your dreams, and never let anyone define your worth. There's something else I should have told you long ago. Your parents, David and Linda, are not your biological parents. I wanted to be the one to tell you, but I never found the right time. For that, I am sorry. I hope, in time, you can forgive me for keeping this from you. No matter what, know this, you are loved. You always have been, and you always will be. With all my heart. Grandfather." Tears blurred the words as I finished reading. For the first time in weeks, it felt like I could hear his voice again, steady, warm, reassuring. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to peace. The letter ignited something in me, a need to understand where I truly came from. With Sarah's help, I began searching for my biological parents. The process was slow, filled with dead ends and frustration, but I refused to give up. Then, one afternoon, Sarah called. "Emily," she said, her voice tinged with excitement, "I think we've found her." My pulse quickened as she explained. My biological mother, a woman named Margaret, lived in a small town a few hours away. She had been young when she had me, and placing me for adoption had been the hardest choice of her life. I made the drive the next morning, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When I arrived, I sat in the car for what felt like hours, trying to steady my breath, trying to decide if I had the strength to knock on the door. Before I could, it opened. A woman stood there, her graying hair tucked behind her ears, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name: hope, fear, longing. "Emily," she whispered. I nodded, my throat tightening. "Hi, Mom." She let out a shaky breath before pulling me into her arms. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was home. The months that followed were a whirlwind of discovery and healing. I learned about the family I never knew I had, about the sacrifices Margaret had made. It wasn't perfect, there were moments of pain, of silence heavy with things neither of us knew how to say, but it was real. At the same time, I slowly began rebuilding my relationship with David and Linda. It wasn't easy. There were days when the betrayal still felt raw, when I wasn't sure if I could ever fully forgive them. But I realized that holding on to resentment would only keep me stuck in the past. So, we started small, phone calls, coffee meetups, tentative conversations that, over time, turned into something resembling understanding. With my inheritance, I created a foundation in my grandfather's name, dedicated to helping young people pursue their dreams. It felt like the best way to honor him, to take the gift he had given me and pass it forward. One evening, as I stood on my apartment balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and crimson, I felt something settle inside me. The journey had been long and painful, but it had led me here, to a place of healing, of hope, of new beginnings. Lifting my glass toward the sky, I whispered, "To you, Grandfather. Thank you for everything." And as the sun slipped below the horizon, I knew, without a doubt, that whatever came next, I was ready.